The Vice President, the Fox News interview, and the full-scale reaction here in Britain over what he did or didn't say. My name's Tom Harwood and this is GBN Originals. Now, huge reaction back here in the UK after an explosive interview aired on Fox News. The Vice President, JD Vance, sat down with Sean Hannity to talk through the consequences of aid withdrawal to Ukraine and the possibility of peace. But it was one comment that has been posted to Twitter, quoted and analysed that has set British politics ablaze. That is, of course, the Vice President was talking about how peace could be guaranteed in Ukraine after any such peace agreement has been agreed. How might that be a sustainable peace, a lasting peace? In his view, the way that is a sustainable peace is that you have American business interests in Ukraine. He called that the strongest possible security guarantee. If there are American businesses, American businessmen, indeed if there are American interests in extracting Ukraine's mineral wealth, well, then the Americans are going to want to protect that, whether or not there is a formal deal in place for military guarantees or not. That's the argument from the White House as things stand. But it was his next sentence that caused a real ruckus in the United Kingdom, because he said that a minerals deal, economic interests from the United States, offer a far greater security guarantee than some random country no one has ever heard of that hasn't fought in a war in 30 or 40 years, offering 20,000 troops. Now, in the UK, many politicians have taken those words to mean Britain and France. Why? They're the only two European countries that have publicly committed to sending troops to Ukraine to guarantee the peace in the event of a peace deal. They're the two military nuclear powers in Europe, the two largest spenders on the military in Europe, and indeed they have that strong connection going back in the past of working together. It's been London and Paris that have hosted the European summits, and indeed the proposals, as reported in the press, do focus around a 20,000 troop deployment, perhaps 10,000 from the United Kingdom and 10,000 from France at any one time, totaling that magic 20,000 number the Vice President referenced in his interview on Fox News. That's taken some commentators and many politicians to put two and two together and say that the countries that the Vice President was referring to were indeed Britain and France. However, the Vice President has since come out to Twitter to say that is not the case, that he was not referring to Britain and France, despite what people thought. But is this a backtrack or what he thought all along? In a follow-up tweet, the Vice President said that he was referring to countries that may not have come public with their ideas about putting troops on the ground in Ukraine. Now, does he know things that we don't know? Perhaps. It could be the Americans know a lot more about these secret negotiations behind the scenes, and perhaps there has been a country that no one has ever heard of, that has not been in a war in 30 or 40 years, that has committed troops to the ground in Ukraine in the event of a peace deal. Or perhaps this is backtracking and the Vice President trying to cover up a diplomatic slip. Many people have different views on this issue, and on GB News we've been interviewing some of the most powerful politicians and opposition leaders in the United Kingdom. First, we spoke to the leader of the opposition, the leader of His Majesty's most loyal opposition, Kemi Badenoch MP. She leads the Conservatives, of course. She calls herself a friend of JD Vance. She thinks he's been misinterpreted.
Well, I know JD Vance quite well. I've looked at the comments. I don't think he actually said that. I think a lot of people are getting carried away. They're saying loads of things and getting quite animated. Let's keep cool heads. America is our closest ally, and I believe that President Trump and JD Vance want peace. They're looking after their national interest. We need to do so as well.
Strong words from Kemi Badenoch, aligning herself more closely with the Trump administration than perhaps anyone else in British politics over this issue. It's strange, however, that her shadow defence secretary has been saying precisely the opposite. Yes, James Cartledge took to Twitter to say that what JD Vance said was wrong, to say that what JD Vance said was an insult to the memory of the Brits who fought and died helping out the Americans. Of course, the only time that Article 5 of the NATO treaty has been triggered, that treaty for collective defence, the only time that it has actually been triggered was after 9/11. It was Europe coming to America's defence, not the other way round. And of course, James Cartledge referred to those conflicts where Britain has stood shoulder to shoulder with the United States, fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq, of course, famously as one of the closest allies of the United States in modern years, in modern decades. He clearly thinks that the Vice President was referring to Britain. Although, of course, what the Vice President might say is he well knew that Britain fought in Iraq and Afghanistan. Indeed, JD Vance served for 6 months as a military journalist in Iraq. So it would be strange for him to say that the United Kingdom hadn't been a part of a military operation that indeed he reported on, that he was on the ground there, and indeed will have known about British actions. It's a confused situation, but perhaps most confusing of all is the split and the communication errors between the leader of the opposition and her own shadow defence secretary. Why are these two politicians not speaking from the same page? Have they not been in communication, or has the line changed over the course of the day? Clearly, there will be issues to work up in Conservative campaign headquarters over whether or not everyone in the shadow cabinet maintains a level of collective responsibility and speaks with one voice, as cabinets and shadow cabinets are wont to do. Of course, this isn't the first time that there's been issues with the Conservative front bench. The front bencher Alicia Kearns, the Shadow Minister for Women and Girls and the Prevention of Violence Against Them, said that the state visit of Donald Trump should be cancelled in the wake of his row with President Zelensky. Reportedly, she received a dressing down from Kemi Badenoch over the issue of collective responsibility, saying that Conservatives should speak with one voice and should follow Kemi Badenoch, the leader of the party, on all of these issues. But that is a matter for the Conservatives to work out for themselves. Perhaps surprisingly, a man who counts himself as incredibly close to Donald Trump, a man who counts himself as a close friend of the incumbent President of the United States, and indeed the Vice President, is Nigel Farage, and he took a very different view on what JD Vance had to say over this country. Whether or not it was the United Kingdom or France or anyone else, it seems that Nigel Farage did seem to think he was talking about Britain.
Okay, and I'm sure you've seen JD Vance's comments, the Vice President of the United States, seeming to suggest that we're just a random country that hasn't fought a war in 30, 40 years. Surely that is a massive insult to those who lost their lives in Afghanistan and Iraq.
JD Vance is wrong. Wrong. For 20 years in Afghanistan, pro rata, our size against America's, we spent the same amount of money, we put the same number of men and women in, and we suffered the same losses. We stood by America all through those 20 years, putting in exactly the same contribution. And all right, they may be 6 times bigger, but we did our bit. So on this one, JD is wrong.
And how much, just in terms of defence spending, how far would you go if you were in government? We're talking about 3% sort of down the line next Parliament. Is that enough if we're going to apparently have to do the heavy lifting?
Well, you know, if you look at the reform contract with the people last year, Starmer's now copied that, I'm pleased to say. But I think the real truth is the world is such a dangerous place. We're going to have to go further and faster. There's no question about it.
And how does it make you feel when Keir Starmer stands up in Parliament and says that you're fawning over Putin and that reform is fawning over Putin?
Well, it's absolutely ludicrous. I mean, you know, Putin visited this country in 2012 and went into Downing Street. A few years before that, the Labour government gave him a state visit with a white tie banquet at Buckingham Palace. You know, we have been totally opposed to what Putin has done from the very start. The only difference between me and the other party leaders over the last few years is they've been pro-war and I've been more realistic and been pro-peace.
Okay, and just on the issue of a state visit, I mean, have you been surprised at how many people have said we shouldn't roll out the red carpet for Donald Trump following his comments about Zelensky and the spectacle that was Friday night?
The British political class have never liked Donald Trump from day one. They never will like Donald Trump. And I get it. You know, his style is not for everybody's cup of tea. But be in no doubt, and it was interesting that Starmer made this point yesterday in the House of Commons, to the silence of the Labour backbenchers, the most crucial relationship we have in the world, particularly at a dangerous time, is our relationship with America. It doesn't mean we'll always agree on everything, but it is absolutely fundamental. And right now, without America, we as a country are literally defenseless. And I want everyone to recognise that.
Just one more, just a minerals deal. Will that be enough to secure peace on its own?
Well, I asked that question yesterday in the House of Commons. Let's see. I don't know what the scale and scope of this minerals deal is going to be. I would suggest that if many, many thousands of Americans and many tens of billions of American dollars were involved with mineral extraction in Ukraine, with, by the way, Ukraine getting a big cut of the profits too, difficult to see Putin invading if thousands of Americans are in the way. Is it enough? I don't know. But is it the beginning of a proper negotiation? Yes. And I do think that Zelensky does need to sign this. I really do. And I get it. For him, it's very, very hard. It's very hard as president of a country to start a process that means you give away some of what was your territory a few years ago. I understand psychologically why this is very tough for Zelensky, but it has to be done.
And you're giving Starmer a lot of support. Would you support British troops on the ground in the event of a peace deal?
I'm very, very, very nervous about it. It doesn't mean there are no circumstances in which I wouldn't, but I'm very nervous about it. What I want to see is the minerals deal signed, and let's move on from there.
And there we have it, a passionate defence of the United Kingdom's involvement, particularly in Afghanistan, showing the true heroism of British armed forces. But clearly now a divide between the Reform Party and the Conservative Party on whether or not they think the Vice President was wrong. Or indeed, whether they think the Vice President was wrong, as Nigel Farage said. Clearly, this will be one that goes on and on, but Nigel Farage is taking a much more strident position than many people would have expected him to. This will be an issue, no doubt, that continues to rage on, and I wonder whether or not further clarification will be coming from the White House. Clearly, the Vice President is relatively new to politics and speaking in less than clear terms opens all sorts of statements up for the most severe criticism, interpretation, or even misinterpretation. And it's been a day of that in Westminster today. But who do you believe and who do you agree with? And what do you make of that entire interview with the Vice President JD Vance on Fox News? Do, as ever, post your views and opinions in the comment section below. But this has been GBN Originals. My name has been Tom Harwood, and remember to subscribe to the GB News YouTube channel for much more exclusive content.